60 kilometers, wingtip to wingtip. That's the Supremacy, the largest warship anyone in the Star Wars galaxy ever bolted together. A crew of 2.25 million people lived inside that thing. It carried an entire fleet in its internal hangars. Thousands of weapons emplacements lined its hull. The First Order built it to be a mobile capital, a shipyard, and a throne room all at once. And in the year 34 ABY, one Mon Calamari cruiser, the Raddus, barely 3 kilometers long, jumped to lightspeed straight through it and cut it in half like a bread knife through warm butter. That silence in the theater? Beautiful. The implications? Franchise-destroying. Because if one medium cruiser can bisect a 60-kilometer megaship just by pointing at it and punching the hyperspace button, then every turbolaser ever mounted, every crew member ever stationed, and every naval battle in Star Wars history was a colossal waste of everyone's time. And the franchise hasn't addressed this. Not really. Not honestly. What they've done instead is mumble 1 in a million in Rise of Skywalker and hope nobody does the math. I did the math. So let's talk about the slow, tragic, deeply stupid evolution of the Dorito space triangle and the writing decisions that made all of it pointless. This isn't a ship specs video. You can get those on Wookieepedia. This is a prosecution. The evidence is the ships themselves, their magnificent capabilities, their awe-inspiring engineering, and their invariably humiliating deaths. 3 arguments. 3 ways Star Wars broke its own universe. Let's go. Argument 1. Every superweapon dies the same way. Here's a list. It's long. That's the point. The Starforge, roughly 3,956 BBY, an automated factory station powered by the dark side of the Force and the energy of a star, capable of producing an essentially unlimited number of warships with minimal raw material input. Production capability that nothing in galactic history would ever match again. Killed by a Jedi strike team that penetrated its defenses while a Republic fleet cleaned up outside. A handful of individuals with lightsabers versus an engine of infinite war production. The individuals won. The Malevolence, 22 BBY, a subjugator-class heavy cruiser, 4,845 meters of hull, carrying 2 massive ion pulse cannons that could disable entire fleets in a single blast. Republic Naval Command couldn't counter it. Conventional assaults were suicide. Anakin Skywalker snuck aboard, reprogrammed the navicomputer, and the whole thing crashed into a moon. 1 Jedi. 1 computer terminal. Nearly 5 kilometers of warship. Gone. The Death Star. 0 BBY. You know this one. 120 kilometers in diameter. Over 1 million personnel. Over 15,000 turbolaser batteries. 20 years of construction. 2 decades of economic output from a galactic empire. Luke Skywalker, in a single T-65 X-Wing, fired 2 proton torpedoes into a thermal exhaust port 2 meters wide. The port connected directly to the main reactor and was only ray-shielded, meaning any physical projectile could waltz right through. Rogue One later revealed that Galen Erso planted that vulnerability deliberately, which, honestly, makes the Empire look worse. Their engineering review couldn't catch sabotage from a scientist they knew was working under coercion. Let's pause and do some math on that one. According to West End Games sourcebook data, an Imperial I-class Star Destroyer ran about 150 million credits. A T-65 X-Wing? Roughly 150,000. That's a 1,000 to 1 cost ratio, and it's the X-Wing that wins the exchange every single time. Luke's X-Wing didn't just kill the Death Star, it killed the economic logic of every capital ship the Empire ever built. You're telling me the most powerful government in the galaxy kept sinking 150 million credits per Star Destroyer into hulls that lose to 150,000 credit fighters? That's not a military budget. That's a bonfire. The Death Star 24 ABY. Bigger. 160 kilometers. The exhaust port problem was fixed. Didn't matter. The station was still under construction, so Lando Calrissian and Wedge Antilles flew the Falcon and an X-Wing straight into the superstructure, reached the main reactor, fired a few shots, and flew out before the whole thing blew. 2 Death Stars, 2 single exploit kills, 0 lessons learned. The Executor, and this one's been bugging people since 1983, 19 kilometers long, over 5,000 weapons emplacements, a crew in the hundreds of thousands, Darth Vader's personal flagship, the most elite warship in the Imperial Starfleet. At Endor, after concentrated rebel fire dropped its bridge deflector shields, a single RZ-1A wing interceptor, 12 meters long, flown by Green Leader Arvel Krynid, slammed into the bridge tower. The command crew died on impact. And this 19-kilometer dreadnought, bristling with 5,000 guns, just lost control. Nosed straight into the Death Star's gravity well and crashed. 12 meters of fighter killed 19 kilometers of warship. There should have been auxiliary bridges. Any ship that size would need redundant command systems. The old expanded universe even confirmed that Imperial Star Destroyers had secondary bridges. The Executor was an order of magnitude larger. It should have had multiple backup command centers. But no. One bridge hit, and a warship that cost more than most planetary GDPs became a fireball. Starkiller Base, 34 ABY. An entire planet converted into a hyperspace weapon that could destroy multiple star systems in a single shot. Its thermal oscillator was identified as the critical vulnerability. Small strike team, targeted bombing run, done. A planet-sized weapon killed by the same playbook that killed the first Death Star 34 years earlier. The Mandator 4 Siege Dreadnought, 2 enormous orbital autocannons designed to crack open planetary shields, wiped out in the opening minutes of The Last Jedi by a single bomber run. Poe Dameron's distraction and a handful of bombers took it from operational to debris. The Zeiston-class Star Destroyers, an entire fleet of them, each one armed with a planet-killing superlaser derived from Death Star technology. Hundreds of ships, each one a Death Star in Star Destroyer form. Their critical weakness? Every single Zeiston needed a signal from a central navigation tower to leave Exegel's atmosphere. Jam the signal, and the entire fleet was grounded. Destroy the tower, or the ship carrying the backup signal, and none of them could navigate out. Hundreds of planet killers, neutralized by what amounts to GPS jamming. You see the pattern? It's not even subtle. Every era, every faction, every level of technological sophistication produces the same result. Something enormous, something expensive, something terrifying, killed by something small, exploiting one vulnerability the builders apparently didn't think about. It's not a trope at this point. It's a structural addiction. Star Wars literally cannot tell a story where the big scary thing is defeated by a bigger, scarier thing, or by sustained conventional warfare. The underdog must find the secret weakness. Always. Every time. For 4,000 years of in-universe history. Which brings us to the real problem. Argument 2. Lightspeed ramming breaks everything. The holdo maneuver. Vice Admiral Amelin Holdo, aboard the Raddus, a 3-kilometer Mon Calamari cruiser, turns the ship toward the Supremacy, engages the hyperdrive, and at the moment of acceleration to lightspeed, impacts the Supremacy's hull. The result isn't a dent. It isn't a hull breach. The Raddus cleaves the Supremacy in half and continues through to shred multiple Resurgent-class Star Destroyers in the escort formation behind it. One cruiser, one jump. A 60-kilometer megaship split open like a tin can, plus collateral destruction of several capital ships in the background. Visually, one of the most stunning shots in the entire franchise. Narratively, a nuclear bomb detonated under the logic of every space battle Star Wars has ever depicted. Think about what this means. If a single cruiser jumping to lightspeed can bisect a ship 20 times its size and destroy its escorts, then lightspeed ramming is, by an absurd margin, the most efficient weapon in the Star Wars galaxy. It's not even close. You don't need turbolasers. You don't need ion cannons. You don't need fighter screens. You don't need a crew of 2.25 million. You need a hyperdrive, a targeting computer, and something with mass. That's it. So why wasn't this done at Yavin? The rebels lost most of red and gold squadrons trying to hit a 2-meter exhaust port. One hyperspace-capable ship aimed at the Death Star's reactor would have done the job. Why wasn't it done at Endor? The rebel fleet was getting shredded between the Death Star's superlaser and the Imperial fleet. A single cruiser jumping through the Executor would have changed the battle instantly. Why wasn't it done at Scarif, where the entire rebel fleet was trapped and desperate? And here's where it gets really damning. You don't even need crewed ships. The Star Wars galaxy has hyperdrives. It has droids. It has autopilot systems that can calculate jumps without a living being on board. The logical endpoint of the holdo maneuver isn't a cruiser with a heroic admiral at the helm. It's a hyperspace missile. Strap a hyperdrive to an asteroid. Program a droid to aim it. Launch it at anything you want dead. Cost of one hyperdrive and one astromech versus cost of a Star Destroyer with a crew of 37,000. The math isn't complicated. But here's the thing that really seals it. Star Wars canon already knows hyperspace collisions are catastrophic, and not just because of the holdo maneuver. The High Republic era, set roughly 232 BBY, kicked off with an event called the Great Disaster. A transport freighter called the Legacy Run was knocked out of hyperspace in the Hetzel system, and its fragmented wreckage, still carrying hyperspace energy, scattered across an entire sector, threatening to destroy multiple inhabited worlds. Chunks of a single freighter nearly wiped out star systems. The entire Galactic Republic mobilized to deal with the crisis. They called the fragments emergences, and each one hit with enough force to devastate a planet. So the Star Wars galaxy, canonically, has known for centuries that objects carrying hyperspace energy can obliterate anything they hit. The Republic spent the entire High Republic era terrified of this exact physics. They experienced it as a disaster. They wrote it into their history books. And then nobody, not one admiral, not one weapons designer, not one desperate rebel commander in 300 years of subsequent warfare thought to aim it on purpose? The Legacy Run was an accident. The holdo maneuver was intentional. Put those two data points together, and you have irrefutable proof that the Star Wars universe understands hyperspace kinetic impacts are apocalyptically destructive, and has understood this for centuries, and still chose to build 1,500 turbolaser triangles instead of hyperspace missiles. That's not a plot hole. That's a plot canyon. The canon response to this? Rise of Skywalker gives us one line. When someone suggests repeating the maneuver, the response is essentially that it was 1 in a million. That's it. That's the entire canonical explanation for why the single most effective military tactic ever demonstrated in the franchise isn't standard operating procedure. And 1 in a million doesn't hold up for even a second. If your alternative is losing your entire fleet, which is what was happening to the Resistance when Holdo made the jump, then 1,000,000-to-1 odds are fantastic. You'd take those odds every time. What military commander, watching their fleet get picked apart ship by ship, wouldn't roll the dice on a 1,000,000-to-1 shot that could obliterate the enemy flagship? That's not a gamble. That's the obvious play. But wait, maybe the odds aren't really the problem. Maybe there's a better explanation buried somewhere in the novels. And there is, sort of. The novelization of The Last Jedi and supplementary canon material have tried to retroactively explain the holdo maneuver by suggesting the Raddus had experimental deflector shields, a unique configuration that somehow allowed the ship to sustain its physical coherence during the initial moment of hyperspace acceleration, letting it impact the Supremacy as a solid mass instead of phasing into hyperspace and passing through harmlessly. The implication being that, under normal circumstances, a ship jumping to lightspeed would simply transition into hyperspace before contact, making the ram impossible. Only the Raddus's special shields created the conditions for impact. Let's prosecute this excuse. First, if experimental shield technology is the key variable, then the 1 in a million line is a lie. It wasn't a lucky shot, it was a hardware capability. Those are two completely different explanations competing for the same narrative space, and neither Lucasfilm nor the story group seems bothered by the contradiction. Second, If you can build shields that enable lightspeed ramming, then you've just invented the most devastating weapon system in galactic history, and the very first thing any competent military R&D department would do is replicate those shields and mount them on unmanned hyperspace missiles. The experimental shield explanation doesn't close the plot hole, it widens it. Now, instead of, why doesn't everyone try this? The question becomes, why isn't everyone building this specific type of shield and weaponizing it? Third, and this is the one that really stings, the Raddus wasn't some prototype fresh off a secret assembly line. It was the Resistance's flagship, their primary command vessel. If its shields were genuinely unique enough to enable an entirely new class of warfare, someone in the Resistance should have known. Holdo should have known. The maneuver shouldn't have been a desperate last resort. It should have been recognized doctrine. If we're about to lose the fleet, point the Raddus at the biggest target and jump. The fact that it's presented as improvisation undermines every attempt to explain it as hardware-dependent. Some fans have pointed to interdiction fields, gravity well projectors that pull ships out of hyperspace and might theoretically prevent a lightspeed ram. But the Supremacy wasn't running one during the chase in The Last Jedi. No interdiction field was mentioned, deployed, or implied. And if interdiction fields are the universal countermeasure, then every single capital ship in the galaxy needs to be running one at all times, which creates its own cascade of logistical problems that the franchise never explores. How much power do they draw? Do they interfere with your own fleet's hyperspace capability? Can a ship even fight effectively while maintaining a gravity well? None of these questions have canon answers, because the franchise would rather not think about it. The Holdo maneuver didn't just create a plot hole. It retroactively invalidated every naval engagement in Star Wars history. Every turbolaser ever fired. Every crew member ever stationed aboard a Star Destroyer. Every trillion-credit warship ever constructed. All of it. Unnecessary. Because one cruiser with a hyperdrive could have done the job faster, cheaper, and more completely. 1,500 turbolasers on the Supremacy. None of them mattered. Argument 3. Technology doesn't progress, so what was the point? Here's the thing nobody talks about enough. In most science fiction universes, technology moves forward. Ships get better. Weapons get stronger. Civilizations climb the tech tree. Star Wars runs in the opposite direction. The Harrower-class dreadnought, backbone of the Sith Empire's fleet around 3,681 BBY, was 800 meters long, with a solid complement of roughly 95 fighters and bombers, heavy turbolaser batteries, and a wedge-shaped profile that would define capital ship design for millennia. Compact, versatile, effective. It was already the triangle, already the concentrated firepower wedge, already the fleet backbone. 3,000 years later, the Galactic Republic, after a full millennium of demilitarization following the Ruusan Reformation of 1000 BBY, reinvented the concept. The Venator class, 1,137 meters, was the most tactically intelligent Star Destroyer ever built. Over 420 starfighters. An enormous dorsal flight deck running nearly the ship's full length. 8 dual heavy turbolaser turrets, 2 medium dual turbolaser cannons, 52 point defense laser cannons, 4 heavy proton torpedo tubes. It was a carrier first, a gun platform second. And that philosophy was, by the franchise's own combat record, exactly correct. Because fighters win everything in Star Wars. Fighters killed the Death Star. Fighters killed the Executor. Fighters killed Starkiller Base. The Venator was designed around the one capability that actually matters in this universe, and the Republic, building a navy from scratch after 1,000 years of peace, accidentally stumbled into the optimal warship configuration. And then the Empire scrapped it. The Imperial I-class Star Destroyer was 1,600 meters long, bigger than the Venator. 60 turbolaser batteries and 60 ion cannon batteries, more guns, but only 72 TIE fighters. The Empire cut the fighter complement by over 80%. Why? One man. One doctrine. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin. The Tarkin Doctrine demanded ships that looked terrifying hanging over a planet, projecting the authority of the state. Political intimidation replaced military effectiveness. A star destroyer parked in orbit above a rebellious world is a statement. A carrier launching invisible fighter swarms is not. Tarkin wanted symbols, monuments, big metal thingies that made whole populations surrender on sight. The triangle got bigger, meaner, scarier looking, and dumber. Not everyone agreed. Grand Admiral Thrawn, arguably the only Imperial strategist who understood any of this, saw the Death Star for what it was, a resource black hole. While Tarkin was pouring the economic output of star systems into a 120-kilometer battle station with, as we now know, a 2-meter fatal flaw, Thrawn was pushing the TIE Defender program. The TIE Defender was everything the standard TIE wasn't: shields, a hyperdrive, heavy armament, warheads. It was, in essence, an admission that the entire Imperial starfighter doctrine had been catastrophically wrong. A fleet of TIE Defenders, operating from Venator-style carriers, would have been the most effective fighting force the galaxy had ever seen. Thrawn knew it. He argued for it. He staked his reputation on it. The Empire defunded the project to pour more resources into the Death Star too. Think about that decision. The Empire had a brilliant tactician telling them, explicitly, that their superweapon strategy was a trap, and that investing in capable starfighters would win the war. They said no. They chose the bigger triangle over the smarter fighter. And then the bigger triangle got blown up at Endor, by fighters. Fighters that had shields and hyperdrives. Fighters that the TIE Defender was designed to match. Thrawn was right. Tarkin was dead. Literally, he died on the first Death Star. And the Empire lost the war because it picked the wrong man's vision. But the regression didn't stop at fleet doctrine. Look at the fighters themselves. The Republic's Clone Wars-era starfighters were genuinely capable combat platforms. The ARC-170 heavy fighter had deflector shields, a Class 1.5 hyperdrive for independent deep space operations, a tail gunner, torpedo launchers, and enough fuel and supplies for long-range missions far from its carrier. Pilots could jump to a target system, fight, and jump home without ever needing a capital ship to ferry them around. The Empire looked at all of this and built the TIE/LN, the standard TIE fighter. No shields, no hyperdrive, no life support beyond what the pilot's suit provided. A twin-ion engine strapped to a cockpit ball with 2 laser cannons and nothing else. Cheap, disposable, completely dependent on a nearby star destroyer to carry it into the combat zone and recover it afterward. If the pilot survived, which Sinar fleet systems didn't seem particularly concerned about. This wasn't a side grade. It was a deliberate step backward. The Empire took starfighter technology that worked, shielded, hyperspace capable, independently operational, and stripped out every feature that kept pilots alive and gave them tactical flexibility. The pilots couldn't retreat to hyperspace if the battle turned. They couldn't operate independently. They couldn't absorb a single hit. And the irony, the painful, screaming irony, is that the rebellion flew shielded, hyperspace-capable fighters. X-Wings had deflector shields and Class 1 hyperdrives. A-Wings had shields. Y-Wings had shields and hyperdrives. The rebels, operating on a shoestring budget cobbled together from donations and stolen equipment, fielded fighters that were individually more capable than what the galaxy-spanning Empire gave its own pilots. When Luke Skywalker made that trench run on the Death Star, he was flying a better-designed fighter than any of the TIEs chasing him. The Empire's technological regression wasn't just philosophical. It got the Death Star blown up. Now apply the exchange rate. An Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, 150 million credits, crew of 37,000, carrying 72 unshielded TIEs. An X-Wing, 150,000 credits, 1 pilot, shields, hyperdrive, proton torpedoes. The Empire is building 150 million credit targets that lose to 150,000 credit fighters at a ratio of 1,000 to 1. Every Star Destroyer that gets gutted by a fighter squadron represents 1,000 X-Wings worth of misallocated resources. The Executor alone, at whatever unholy price tag a 19-kilometer dreadnought commands, was worth tens of thousands of X-wings. And it died to one A-wing that cost less than a rounding error on its procurement budget. The Venator could put 420 fighters into space. The Imperial class carried 72 unshielded, hyperdriveless TIEs. And then the Empire's biggest ships kept getting killed by fighters that had shields and hyperdrives. That's not evolution. That's regression wearing a bigger hat. And it never stopped. The First Order's Resurgent class was essentially an Imperial-class Star Destroyer scaled up to 2,915 meters. Twice the size. Same philosophy. More turbolasers, more armor, same vulnerability to anything small and fast that could find a weak point. The definition of insanity, etc. The Supremacy pushed the concept to its logical extreme. 60 kilometers of hull, millions of crew, a mobile capital that could project power across star systems. Peak technology, peak investment, peak absurdity. Split in half by a 3-kilometer cruiser that just aimed and jumped. The Zeiston fleet was the final joke. Hundreds of star destroyers, each one carrying a planet-killing superlaser, mass-produced by the Final Order on Exegol. The culmination of everything. Decades of Death Star research, miniaturized into a Star Destroyer hull, replicated hundreds of times over, ready to enforce galactic obedience through sheer volume of planet-killing capability. And every single one of them was dependent on a navigation signal from one tower to leave the atmosphere. Jam the signal, ground the fleet. 3,000 years of Star Destroyer evolution, from the Harrower's 800 meters to the Zeiston's planet-killing armada, and the final iteration couldn't fly without external GPS. So, what's actually happening here? Strip away the lore. Forget the in-universe explanations. What's actually happening is simple. Star Wars needs bigger ships because the franchise needs bigger visual spectacles. And it needs those ships to die from single exploits because the franchise needs underdogs to win. Every trilogy has to raise the stakes visually. Bigger Death Star, bigger Star Destroyer, planet-sized weapon, fleet of planet killers. And then every trilogy has to let the scrappy heroes beat those stakes with ingenuity and a prayer. That's the formula. It's been the formula since 1977. The problem is that 47 years of repeating this formula has produced a universe where the single smartest military strategy would be to strap a hyperdrive to a rock and aim it at whatever you don't like. And the single dumbest strategy, the one every civilization keeps choosing for 4,000 years, is building a bigger triangle with a single critical flaw, and then staffing it with millions of people who all die when someone finds the flaw. The galaxy's admirals keep ordering bigger Doritos. The galaxy's writers keep killing them with one weird trick. And the audience keeps noticing. Here's what makes it melancholy instead of just frustrating. These ships are gorgeous. The designs are iconic. The engineering specs are genuinely awe-inspiring. And the people who love them, who build models, who memorize turbolaser counts, who argue Venator versus Imperial class at 2 in the morning on Reddit, they're right to love them. The Star Destroyer silhouette is one of the most recognizable shapes in all of science fiction. The opening shot of A New Hope, that Imperial class filling the screen from top to bottom while the little Corvette runs for its life. That's cinema. Nobody's arguing with that. The designs aren't the problem. The problem is a franchise that builds cathedrals and then knocks them down with the same wrecking ball every single time, and expects us not to notice that the wrecking ball never changes shape. Somewhere out there, in a version of Star Wars that doesn't exist, an Imperial admiral looked at the executor's blueprints, noticed the bridge tower had no redundant command facility, and sent the whole thing back to Kuat drive yards with a memo that could peel paint. In that universe, someone at the First Order looked at the Supremacy's threat assessment and said, "What if they just jump a ship at us?" In that universe, Thrawn's TIE Defender program got funded instead of the second Death Star. The Venator's carrier doctrine survived, and technology actually progressed instead of running backward in a bigger hat. The biggest triangle in the galaxy didn't die to the smallest thing the writer could think of. But that's not the universe we got. We got the one where every Dorito dies the same way. Lightspeed ramming makes all of it moot. And 4,000 years of shipbuilding added up to absolutely nothing. At least they looked cool doing it. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one.